Welcome to True Echo, where real stories ripple into change. Today's story isn't just about a courtroom, a judge, or a custody battle. It's about a nurse, a mother, and a woman who stood up in the most humiliating moment of her life and turned it into history. This is the story of Jasmine Carter, the woman who walked into court wearing scrubs, was humiliated by a judge, and left as a national symbol of justice and dignity. Watch closely, because what she did next made the courtroom explode with applause and changed America forever. The Jefferson County Courthouse buzzed with subdued tension. The morning sun filtered through tall, frosted windows, casting pale beams across the polished floors and the towering oak benches. It was 9 a.m. sharp, and already, every seat in the courtroom was filled. At the far end, the large double doors creaked open. Jasmine Carter entered. She didn't glide in like the lawyers in crisp suits or the wealthy defendants in designer heels. No. Jasmine came in with worn-out sneakers, her light blue scrubs still stained with streaks of blood. Her bun was messy, her face pale with exhaustion, and yet, there was something in the way she held herself that made people pause. It was the kind of presence born not from confidence but necessity. She had just finished a grueling 12-hour emergency room shift at St. Joseph's Hospital. Her last patient? A 7-year-old boy clinging to life after a horrific car crash. She'd barely managed to keep him alive. No time to shower. No time to change. Just time to run, breathless, from the ambulance bay to this courtroom. Because today, she was fighting for her children. Two small lives, Josh and Lily, whose fate rested in the hands of the court. And on the bench, presiding over the custody case, sat Judge Eleanor Mitchell. As Jasmine made her way to her seat beside her lawyer, Matt Anderson, the whispers started. She came here dressed like that? Is that blood on her? She must be irresponsible. Jasmine's stomach twisted, but she sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Her fingers still bore the red imprints of the latex gloves she had removed barely an hour before. Across the room, her ex-husband, Ryan Maxwell, smirked in his tailored navy suit. A successful real estate investor with deep pockets and deeper connections, Ryan looked like he belonged in a courtroom built for appearances. Jasmine, however, looked like she had just stepped off the front lines, which, in truth, she had. The courtroom door shut behind her with a soft thud. And then Judge Mitchell spoke. Her voice was crisp, controlled, cold. "Miss Carter, this is a courtroom, not an emergency room," she said, peering over her glasses. "Do you find it appropriate to appear here looking like that?" A hush swept across the room. Jasmine's face flushed, but she said nothing. Her lawyer Matt leaned toward her, whispering, "Don't react. Let it pass." But the judge wasn't finished. "You're here to determine the fate of your own children," Judge Mitchell continued. "And yet, you arrived disheveled and clearly unprepared. Do you think a uniform soaked in blood somehow exempts you from courtroom decorum?" Jasmine blinked slowly. Her heart pounded so loudly she couldn't hear the shuffle of papers or the shifting of bodies in the room. All she could hear were the words, each one sharper than the last. Disheveled. Unprepared. Irresponsible. Do you even deserve to be a mother? The words weren't spoken, but they were heard. Across the aisle, Ryan leaned back with a smug tilt of his head, clearly enjoying the show. To him, this wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was theater. And Jasmine, exhausted, humiliated, underdressed, was already losing. Judge Mitchell lifted a gavel slightly, preparing to move forward with the hearing, but Jasmine raised her hand. For a moment, time stood still. Matt's eyes widened. "Jasmine, don't." But she stood up. Her voice was calm, clear, stronger than anyone expected. "Your Honor," Jasmine said, "these aren't pajamas. They're a uniform. They're what I wore while saving a 7-year-old boy's life this morning. His blood is on these clothes because I chose to keep working, to keep trying even when his pulse disappeared for a full minute." You could hear a pin drop. "I had two options, change clothes and risk missing this hearing, or walk in here exactly as I am, tired, imperfect, but having done something good. I chose the second." Gasps echoed softly through the room. Even Judge Mitchell, poised and polished, sat a little straighter. Her eyes blinked. "What?" "I apologize if I offend your sense of decorum," Jasmine continued, "but my priority was a child. And right now it's my own." For a heartbeat, the room was frozen. And then applause. Soft at first, then louder, then standing. Members of the gallery, nurses in the back row, even court staff rose to their feet. Judge Mitchell banged the gavel. "This is a court of law. Sit down. Order." But the moment had already broken through. Jasmine sat down again, her hands still trembling slightly, but her gaze no longer cast downward. For the first time in years she looked her ex-husband in the eye. And he looked away. Because something had shifted. The judge's prejudice had been laid bare. The courtroom had seen it. Felt it. And Jasmine, against all odds, had turned humiliation into honor. But she knew this wasn't over. The system didn't change with applause. Judges didn't rewrite rulings because the crowd stood up. This was still a war. And she had just won the first battle. Jasmine sat down, her breath slow but steady, as the applause reluctantly faded and the courtroom returned to its tense, brittle silence. Her lawyer, Matt Anderson, leaned toward her, whispering in a voice filled with awe, "I don't know what that was, Jasmine, but it might have changed everything." But Jasmine didn't respond. She kept her eyes focused straight ahead, not out of defiance but survival. She had lived too long in a world where silence was sometimes safer than being right. Across the aisle, Ryan Maxwell looked rattled. His lawyer, Richard Bennett, a seasoned litigator known for his icy tactics and ruthless precision, furiously scribbled notes. This wasn't going according to plan. They had expected a worn-down, tired woman. Instead they got a storm. Judge Eleanor Mitchell tapped her pen against her desk, her jaw tight, her expression unreadable. She was used to commanding the courtroom, not being challenged in it. And certainly not by someone she had so casually dismissed. She adjusted her glasses. "Miss Carter," she said again, her voice slightly less frigid, "while I acknowledge the gravity of your explanation, we must proceed. This court must decide what is in the best interest of your children." Jasmine gave a small nod. "Yes, Your Honor." But Mitchell wasn't done. "You may think your actions were noble, and perhaps they were," she said. "But being a good nurse is not the same as being a good mother." That hit harder than anything else. Jasmine blinked but didn't flinch. She didn't show the crack forming beneath the surface. She had learned to hold it all together, the grief, the exhaustion, the constant balancing act of saving lives at work while trying to raise 2 children alone. But Matt Anderson rose before she had to answer. "Your Honor," he said smoothly but with steel in his voice, "I respectfully request to call our first character witness." Judge Mitchell nodded, unimpressed. "Proceed." Matt turned toward the courtroom doors, which opened at that exact moment. A figure stepped inside. Tall, graceful, white coat gleaming under the courtroom lights. Dr. Maria Gonzalez, the chief of emergency medicine at St. Joseph's. Jasmine's supervisor for nearly a decade. A respected leader. And today, her unexpected ally. The courtroom buzzed again. Jasmine's eyes widened. She hadn't known Maria was coming. In fact, she was sure the woman hadn't left the hospital in days. The thought that she'd made time for this? It sent a warmth through Jasmine's chest stronger than anything she had felt all day. Dr. Gonzalez took the stand, swore in, and looked directly at Judge Mitchell with the calm, unwavering demeanor of someone who had witnessed life at its most brutal, and still chosen to fight for it. "Dr. Gonzalez," Matt began, "can you tell the court about the events of this morning?" The doctor's voice was low and steady. "At approximately 4:12 a.m., a 7-year-old boy arrived in our trauma unit with massive internal bleeding, blunt force trauma to the head, and a ruptured spleen. He was not expected to survive the hour." She paused. And Miss Jasmine Carter was the first to respond. There was silence as Maria continued, describing how Jasmine had stabilized the boy, administered compressions, assisted during the emergency surgery, and refused to leave his side until he was stable. She worked for nearly 3 hours without a break. When we finally got him breathing on his own again, she looked at the clock and said, "I have to go. I have a court hearing." Matt gave her a moment to breathe before asking, "And in your professional opinion, how would you describe Miss Carter's performance?" Maria didn't hesitate. "Exceptional. She's the most selfless, dependable, and emotionally intelligent nurse I've worked with in 25 years. She turned directly to Judge Mitchell. "And if I had a child, God forbid, who needed saving, I'd pray Jasmine Carter was on duty." The courtroom was quiet again. But this time not with judgment. With reverence. Even Judge Mitchell looked down, pretending to read her notes, as if trying to distance herself from the very emotion she'd claimed to rise above. Matt stepped forward. "Dr. Gonzalez, is it true you had no obligation to be here today?" "Yes." "So why did you come?" Dr. Gonzalez looked across the courtroom, not at Jasmine, not at Matt, but directly at the bench. "Because I heard what was said to her this morning. And I couldn't stay silent." Her voice broke just for a second. "I've watched Jasmine walk into that hospital every day for 8 years. I've seen her work 2 shifts back to back. I've seen her miss birthdays, holidays, weekends, all so she could save someone else's family. She deserves the right to protect her own." A tear slipped down Jasmine's cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She wanted it seen. For the first time in years, she wasn't crying alone. As Dr. Gonzalez stepped down, the courtroom remained hushed, stunned by the force of her testimony. Even Richard Bennett looked uneasy. And then Matt produced a letter. "Your Honor," he said gently, "I have one final item. A handwritten note from the parents of the boy Jasmine saved this morning." Judge Mitchell's face twitched. "Proceed." Matt unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. His voice cracked as he read. "To the Honorable Court. We are the parents of the little boy who nearly died this morning. We were told he had minutes to live. That's when we met Jasmine Carter. She didn't just save our son. She saved us. She never mentioned this hearing. Never complained. We learned later she left straight from the trauma room to come here and fight for her own kids. If that's not what a good mother looks like, then we don't know what is. Please, give her what she deserves. Sincerely, David and Sarah Thompson." Matt folded the letter and sat down. No one moved. Even Judge Mitchell looked shaken, her hands resting on the bench, fingers laced tightly, as if gripping something invisible just to keep herself steady. Jasmine exhaled softly. And for the first time since entering that courtroom, she allowed herself to hope. To believe that truth, real truth, might actually matter. But outside the courthouse, a storm was brewing. And Jasmine had no idea the entire nation was about to know her name. While the courtroom held its collective breath, the world outside was exhaling all at once. What Jasmine Carter didn't know, what none of them inside knew, was that something monumental had already begun unfolding just beyond the marble walls and stained glass windows of the Jefferson County Courthouse. A video, just 60 seconds long, secretly recorded by Emily Harper, a young law intern barely out of college, seated quietly in the back row. She had captured everything: the judge's demeaning words, the blood-stained scrubs, Jasmine's quiet composure, and then her powerful rebuttal that silenced the room. Emily had uploaded the clip to TikTok with a short but searing caption. "Black nurse humiliated by judge after saving a child's life. You need to see this." Hashtags followed like wildfire. Hashtag justice for Jasmine, hashtag scrubs our uniforms, hashtag dignity in court. Within minutes, the video hit 100,000 views. By the time Dr. Gonzalez finished her testimony, it had already surpassed 500,000. And by the time Matt read the Thompsons' letter aloud, it had reached over 2 million people and was being reposted across Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. And every platform had the same response: outrage. This is how we treat heroes? She's a nurse. A mother. Are you kidding me? Judge Mitchell should be ashamed. She saved a kid and still had to defend herself in court? I'm crying. In a time where the public was starved for stories of justice and truth, Jasmine's moment hit a nerve. She didn't just speak truth to power. She did it in scrubs, blood-stained, under fluorescent courtroom lights, while fighting for her children. And it lit the internet on fire. By 11:15 a.m., national media had picked it up. CNN ran the headline: "Black ER nurse shamed for saving a life, her response goes viral." MSNBC labeled it, "Courtroom hero, nurse's words shake justice system." ABC News sent a camera crew to the courthouse steps. Local news vans lined up like dominoes outside Jefferson County. But none of this had reached Jasmine yet. Inside, she sat quietly, tears drying on her cheek, her hands clenched together in her lap, unaware that millions of strangers were now standing with her. Judge Mitchell, still visibly shaken, rubbed her temple and called for a 10-minute recess. As people filtered out of the courtroom, Jasmine remained seated. Matt leaned toward her, voice hushed. "Jasmine, you did it." She looked at him dazed. "Did what?" Matt glanced at the bailiff, then back. "You didn't just defend yourself. You woke people up." Just then the courtroom doors opened and Emily Harper slipped through, breathless. She looked at Jasmine with wide eyes full of apology and admiration. "I recorded what happened," Emily whispered. "I uploaded it. I didn't mean to break any rules, I couldn't let it stay inside this room." Jasmine blinked. "You what?" "It's everywhere," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Everyone's talking about you. People are outside. Reporters. Nurses. Parents. Doctors." Matt's jaw dropped. "Wait outside." Emily nodded. "You should see it." Jasmine stood, her knees wobbling. She crossed the courtroom with hesitant steps and followed Emily to the tall courthouse window. And there it was. A sea of people. Hundreds, maybe thousands, gathered outside. Some held signs. Others wore scrubs. Many held candles or flowers. A massive handmade banner stretched across the courthouse gates read, "Jasmine, we stand with you." Jasmine gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. Tears welled up again, not from pain but from overwhelming disbelief. A tide of compassion, fierce and loud, had risen up behind her without her even knowing it. She turned to Emily, her voice shaking. "Why?" Emily's answer was simple. "Because you didn't just speak up for yourself. You spoke up for all of us." Meanwhile, across the city, across the country, the movement surged. Hospitals encouraged staff to wear scrubs in solidarity. Influencers posted videos in support of Jasmine. Hashtags climbed into the top 3 trends on Twitter. And political figures began to weigh in. At 11:43 a.m., Congresswoman Dana Brooks tweeted, "A mother, a nurse, a hero. Jasmine Carter deserves respect, not ridicule. This injustice will not be ignored." By noon, CNN's coverage of the story interrupted their regular programming. And still, Jasmine remained in the courthouse, unaware of how much bigger this had become. Back inside, Judge Mitchell returned to the bench. But something in her demeanor had changed. The armor had cracked. The usual tightness in her voice was replaced by a breath of hesitation. She glanced toward her clerk, then to the security officer whispering something urgently in her ear. Mitchell's eyes flicked to the window, and she saw the crowd outside for the first time. Then she saw the sign. She exhaled, long, slow, and looked back toward the courtroom. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her gavel. "This court is now back in session." Everyone turned. "Before we continue," Mitchell said, her voice lower, almost subdued, I would like to acknowledge something." The silence was pin-drop sharp. "I made a judgment earlier today based on appearances," she said slowly, carefully. "I see now that judgment was premature, inappropriate, and not in the spirit of this court's responsibility to seek truth and fairness." A murmur rippled through the gallery. "I wish to apologize to Miss Jasmine Carter, not just as a judge but as a human being." Gasp. Audible, shocked, sincere. Judge Mitchell, known for her rigidity, had never apologized from the bench. Ever. Jasmine sat still, her chest heaving with emotion. And then Mitchell looked straight at her. "You showed us all what true strength looks like. And the record will reflect that." Outside, the crowd cheered, the sound somehow leaking through thick courtroom walls, echoing faintly through the chambers like a whispered promise. A promise that something was changing. Something real. Something long overdue. The sound from outside the courthouse windows swelled, a rolling wave of voices chanting Jasmine's name, blending into a unified roar that seemed to wrap the courtroom in something sacred. For a few long seconds, even the gavel, even Judge Mitchell's authority, felt small in comparison to the rising tide of the people. Inside, Jasmine sat stunned. She had been on her feet for over 15 hours. Her body ached. Her scrubs clung to her like heavy fabric drenched in history. And yet, right now, she didn't feel weak. She felt seen, heard, understood. It was a feeling she hadn't known in years. Judge Mitchell, composed but clearly shaken, continued. "In light of recent developments and public interest, I will allow a final witness statement before we proceed to closing arguments. Mr. Anderson?" Matt Anderson rose from his chair, straightening his jacket. "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to call Jasmine Carter back to the stand." Jasmine stood, surprised but silent, and walked with measured steps to the witness chair. As she was sworn in, Matt approached her slowly, like he wasn't just representing her legally, but emotionally. She was no longer his client. She was the voice of a movement now. "Jasmine," he began, "you've spoken already to this court, but I'd like you to speak again. Not just as a nurse or a mother, but as yourself. Speak not to win this case, but to be heard." Jasmine's eyes locked with his. And she spoke. "My name is Jasmine Carter," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "I'm a nurse. I'm a mother. I'm a woman who's made sacrifices, a lot of them, because I believe in something bigger than myself." She paused. "I didn't come here today to become a symbol. I didn't know that standing up for myself would turn into something this big. I came here because I love my children. Because they're my life." A few jurors, though this wasn't a jury trial, shifted uncomfortably. Some were dabbing tears. Even the clerk held a hand near her mouth, visibly moved. "I've missed birthdays. I've worked on Christmas mornings. I've slept in my car during double shifts just so I could afford rent and groceries. And yes, I showed up here in scrubs stained with blood, not because I don't care about this court, but because someone else's child almost died, and I couldn't walk away." Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. "I don't ask for praise. I don't need a headline. All I ask is that I not be judged by the way I look when I've been doing the job this society counts on people like me to do. Jasmine turned slightly in her seat and looked directly at Judge Mitchell. We're all human, Your Honor. But today I'm asking that we all remember, even the most tired, even the ones in messy scrubs, even those who don't walk in with suits and makeup, we matter too. A silence swept over the room, deeper than the one before. Matt nodded gently and stepped back. No further questions, Your Honor. Richard Bennett remained seated. He didn't stand. Didn't cross-examine. He simply whispered to Ryan Maxwell, who nodded, lips pressed in a thin, anxious line. Judge Mitchell leaned forward, her hands clasped. Mr. Bennett? Bennett slowly rose. Your Honor, the defense waives closing statements. The courtroom gasped again. What? Judge Mitchell blinked, surprised. You're sure? Yes, Your Honor, Bennett said, his voice flat but strangely respectful. We believe the court has everything it needs. Mitchell gave a long look, not just at him but at the entire courtroom as though scanning every face for something deeper. Then she slowly stood, her robe shifting around her like curtains pulling back on a stage. This court will now recess briefly before delivering a ruling. The gavel fell. And suddenly the room burst into a low thrum of murmurs, camera flashes, and scattered applause before the bailiff restored order. Jasmine stepped down from the stand. Her legs were wobbly now, not from fear but from the adrenaline crashing out of her body. Matt reached for her arm, steadying her, his expression full of quiet pride. You were more than enough, he whispered. They stepped outside the courtroom where a wave of media met them like a flood. Microphones. Flashes. Jasmine. Do you have a statement? How do you feel knowing you've become the face of a national movement? What would you say to other working mothers facing discrimination? Security intervened, clearing a path for Jasmine and her team as they were ushered into a small private room to wait for the verdict. Inside, Jasmine finally collapsed into a chair, her body giving in to exhaustion. Matt stood beside her, glancing at his phone, eyes wide. You're everywhere, he said, handing her the screen. On it was the TikTok video. Now past 5 million views. Comments streamed non-stop. Crying right now. I'm a nurse. This hit home. She's a mother and a hero. Period. Give her those kids. She earned them 100x over. Jasmine read in silence, her throat tightening. Then the door opened. A clerk entered. The judge is ready. Jasmine stood, knees shaking. And with each step back into that courtroom, she carried the voices of millions behind her. The silence inside the courtroom was unlike any before. Not the awkward hush of judgment, nor the waiting lull between legal jargon. This was the silence of something sacred, of a moment the entire room knew would be remembered long after the chairs were emptied and the lights dimmed. Jasmine Carter stood tall, back in her seat next to Matt Anderson, every muscle in her body screaming with fatigue but her eyes, those eyes, steady, focused and radiant with a quiet kind of power. She glanced toward the judge's bench. Judge Eleanor Mitchell was already seated, her expression composed yet softer than it had ever been. The woman who once weaponized appearance and tone now looked humbled, even nervous. The bailiff stepped forward and announced, "Court is now back in session." A collective breath was held. Judge Mitchell looked down at her notes, then slowly back up at the room. She adjusted her glasses. Her fingers drummed briefly on the wood before clasping together. This court, she began, has heard extensive testimony regarding the character, responsibility, and fitness of Miss Jasmine Carter as a parent. Her gaze lingered on Jasmine, and this time, it held no scorn, only a mix of reflection and something almost like reverence. In my many years on the bench, I have seen every kind of custody case. I've seen wealth used as a shield. I've seen love twisted into leverage. But today I saw something different. Pause. I saw integrity, sacrifice, and above all, the courage to be seen when the world would rather look away. The crowd sat still, breathless. Miss Carter, she continued, her voice deepening, it is the opinion of this court that your actions, both in the hospital and in this courtroom, speak to a level of devotion and responsibility that cannot be ignored. Jasmine's hands trembled in her lap. I hereby grant full custody of Joshua and Lily Carter to you. The moment hung in the air. Then it hit. The courtroom erupted. Cheers. Cries. Applause thundered against the walls. Reporters scrambled to capture every second. Outside, the roar of the crowd grew louder, echoing through the windows as if the entire world had exhaled together. Jasmine didn't move. She sat frozen, her hands clasped to her mouth, tears pouring freely now. Not from pain. Not from injustice. but from the deepest relief she had ever known. Matt Anderson patted her back, barely holding back his own emotion. "You did it," he whispered. "You really did it." Across the aisle, Ryan Maxwell sat stunned, eyes glazed over. For the first time he looked like the man Jasmine once knew, arrogant, entitled, but now hollow. Not angry. Just defeated. Beside him, Richard Bennett remained seated, his arms crossed, his lips a tight line. But when Jasmine stood to leave, he did something no one expected. He nodded. A small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it was there. A sign of acknowledgement, respect, maybe even regret. As Jasmine made her way toward the courtroom exit, applause still ringing behind her, she passed Judge Mitchell. Their eyes met. And in that glance, no words were spoken, but a lifetime of barriers fell. Because in this courtroom, built on rules and rank and reputation, one woman in bloodstained scrubs had just rewritten what justice could look like. Outside the courthouse, the crowd surged forward as Jasmine stepped into view. Signs were raised high. Mothers like Jasmine built this nation. Scrubs are not shame, they are sacrifice. We see you. We hear you. We thank you. Cameras flashed. Microphones thrust forward. But Jasmine didn't stop to speak. Instead, she walked through the crowd like Moses parting the sea, not with force but with grace. Reporters called her name. Nurses reached out, some with tears streaming down their faces. One woman sobbed as she hugged Jasmine tightly. "My daughter's in nursing school," she whispered. "Thank you for making her believe she matters." Jasmine embraced her in return, words failing, heart full. From somewhere in the crowd, Jasmine heard a child's voice cry out, "Mommy." She turned. Josh and Lily rushing forward, arms wide. And Jasmine, in the same scrubs that once invited shame, dropped to her knees and caught them both. They wrapped around her like vines to a tree, clinging, sobbing, laughing. "You're coming home?" Josh whispered. "Yes, baby," Jasmine said, holding him tighter than she ever had. "Forever." A roar of joy surged around them. And still, Jasmine didn't notice the cameras, the reporters, the media vans. She noticed only her children, her arms, her future. They had tried to strip her dignity and she had given them power. They tried to shame her uniform and she turned it into a national symbol. They tried to silence her, and now her voice echoed across the country. That evening, as the sun dipped below the courthouse dome, Jasmine Carter stood beneath it all, blood-stained scrubs and all, and quietly made her way home. But the world was only beginning to understand that Jasmine Carter had become more than just a mother who won a custody battle. She had become a movement. Night fell over Jefferson County, but the fire Jasmine Carter had sparked only burned brighter. By the time she returned home with her children, Jasmine's story was leading every major news channel. Her image, tear-streaked, in scrubs, arms wrapped around Josh and Lily, had become iconic. Not because it was staged or polished, but because it was real. CNN opened with a special segment titled, "The Nurse Who Stood Tall, How Jasmine Carter Changed the Face of Justice." MSNBC called it, "Scrubs, Sacrifice and Strength, the Trial That Awakened America." Even conservative outlets, often skeptical of such viral moments, couldn't ignore the groundswell. Commentators who would typically dismiss a story like Jasmine's were unusually quiet, because this time the public wasn't divided. They were unified. Jasmine's inbox was flooded. Thousands of messages poured in from all over the country, from nurses, mothers, single parents, first responders, Black professionals who saw their own struggle reflected in her battle. Some wrote in support, others with raw, tearful stories of their own courtroom humiliations and quiet sacrifices. But amid all the noise, Jasmine did not retreat into the spotlight. She returned to work. 2 days after the trial, she was back at St. Joseph's Hospital, wearing clean scrubs, walking into the ER like she always had, quietly, humbly, and with the same steady hands that had saved countless lives. It was her supervisor, Dr. Maria Gonzalez, who met her at the hospital entrance with an envelope and a smile. "You're going to want to read this," she said, slipping Jasmine the paper. Inside was a formal letter. The American Labor and Service Museum, Washington, D.C. Request for historical artifact donation. Subject: Nurse Jasmine Carter's trial-worn uniform. Jasmine blinked. "They want my scrubs?" Dr. Gonzalez nodded, her eyes misty. "They want to display them. Next to Rosa Parks' coat. The firefighter's helmet from 9/11. They say you reminded the country that heroism doesn't always wear a cape. Sometimes it wears blue cotton and carries a clipboard." Jasmine sat down on the curb outside the ER, overwhelmed. She looked at her hands, The same ones that had shaken when she stood before Judge Mitchell. The same ones that had carried her babies, pumped air into dying lungs, tied up shoes, wiped away blood and held back truth for too long. And now those hands had written history. She nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "They can have them." A week later, under a quiet ceremony attended by healthcare workers, civil rights leaders, and even a handful of humbled legal professionals, Jasmine Carter's scrubs were placed behind protective glass at the museum. Beside them, a small plaque read, "These scrubs belong to Jasmine Carter, a nurse and mother whose courage in the courtroom reignited the national conscience. Worn during a 12-hour ER shift and into a courtroom where she was ridiculed, these garments now represent not shame but sacrifice. Not disrespect but dignity." Visitors flooded the exhibit. Nurses cried in front of the display. Fathers told their daughters Jasmine's story. Teachers added it to their curriculum. But Jasmine didn't change. She still lived in the same modest house in Northbridge, Maryland. Still packed her kids' lunches with care. Still worked double shifts when needed. She declined TV interviews, rejected lucrative book deals, and quietly asked to remain just a nurse. "I never asked to be famous," she told Dr. Gonzalez. "I just wanted to be heard." Still, the world had more in store. Because in the weeks that followed, the Carter Standard Resolution began circulating in state legislatures. Drafted by a bipartisan group of lawmakers, the resolution proposed legal protection for healthcare workers attending court in uniform after shifts, official recognition of medical attire as professional, not informal, a mandatory bias and dignity training for judges and legal officers nationwide. The proposal shocked even its authors with how quickly it gained support. Within 30 days, 23 states introduced their own version. By day 45, Congress had scheduled it for debate. On day 60 it passed, unanimously. The country had shifted. And Jasmine Carter, once humiliated for showing up in scrubs, had redefined what justice looked like. But for Jasmine, the moment that meant the most didn't come in the form of applause or policy. It came one quiet evening as she sat at her kitchen table helping her daughter Maya with homework. Maya looked up with big eyes and asked, "Mom, will people remember you in 100 years?" Jasmine smiled, running her fingers through her daughter's hair. "Maybe. Maybe not. But I hope they remember what I stood for." "What's that?" Jasmine didn't need to think. That no one's dignity should depend on their clothes. That love speaks louder than titles. And that truth, even quiet truth, always echoes. Outside, the streets of Northbridge were quiet. But in living rooms across America, in hospitals and courtrooms and classrooms, Jasmine's story had taken root. She had reminded them that sometimes showing up exactly as you are, tired, messy, flawed, is the bravest thing you can do. 1 year after the courtroom erupted in applause for a woman in bloodstained scrubs, the town of Northbridge stood still. The mayor had called for a special assembly, not in a grand auditorium or under political banners, but at the town's humble central square, surrounded by old maple trees and brick sidewalks worn by generations. On a modest platform with no fanfare, she cleared her throat and read aloud the resolution. From this day forward, April 14th shall be known as Jasmine Carter Day in the city of Northbridge, Maryland. In honor of the mother, the nurse, and the woman who reminded us that the measure of humanity is not in wealth or status, but in courage, compassion, and quiet resistance. The crowd didn't cheer. They stood in reverent silence, many holding candles, others clasping hands, some wiping tears. Jasmine stood at the edge of the gathering, dressed plainly in jeans and a white blouse, her arms wrapped protectively around Josh and Lily. She hadn't wanted the spotlight. She never did. But this time, she showed up for everyone else. On the platform, a student stepped up to the microphone. She was no older than 13. Dark-skinned, curly-haired, nervous, and holding a small card with both hands. "My name is Tasha. I want to be a nurse like Miss Carter one day. And I just want to say, because of her, I believe I can." A gasp of quiet emotion rippled through the crowd. And Jasmine, blinking back tears, finally stepped forward. Not to deliver a speech, not to bask in praise, but to kneel beside Tasha, wrap her in an embrace, and whisper something only the young girl could hear. "Then don't let anyone tell you you can't." Later that night, Jasmine returned home and sat alone at her dining table while her kids slept peacefully in their rooms. On the table sat stacks of unopened letters, handwritten notes, packages, photographs, drawings from children, stories from other nurses, janitors, teachers, all touched by her fight. She picked up one envelope. It was from Judge Eleanor Mitchell. Jasmine opened it slowly, unfolding the note inside. Dear Jasmine, I once believed I could see everything clearly from the bench. That wisdom came from robes, years, and rulings. But it was in watching you that I saw what true justice really looks like. You changed me. And you gave me back something I hadn't realized I'd lost: humility. Thank you. Eleanor Mitchell. Jasmine read the letter twice, her hands trembling. Then she quietly folded it and placed it in a small wooden box with the other letters she couldn't yet bring herself to read. She stood, walked to the window, and looked up at the stars. The same sky she had prayed under the night before the trial. Back then she had begged only for strength, not attention, not applause. Just enough strength to show up. And now the world was showing up with her. The Carter Standard had become federal law. Judges were undergoing new bias training. Courtrooms across the country now displayed plaques that read, "Dignity is not decided by dress. Truth does not depend on status. Every voice matters here." In schools, children learned her story as part of history lessons on modern civil rights. At hospitals, April 14th was observed as Scrubs Day, with all staff encouraged to wear their uniforms proudly, no white coats to cover them. Because of Jasmine, what once invited shame now represented service. Still, Jasmine never let the headlines change her. She kept her job, cooked dinner for her kids, sang to Lily at bedtime, took Josh to soccer practice. And every time she looked in the mirror, she saw not a symbol, but a woman who stood up when it mattered. A woman who simply refused to be quiet. One afternoon, months later, she was approached by a local university dean who offered her an honorary doctorate in human service and civic impact. Jasmine politely declined. "Not because I'm not honored," she said, "but because I want my story to remind people that you don't need a degree, a title, or a podium to change the world. You just need to show up." And show up she did. Again and again. Quietly. Relentlessly. With love. That was the power of Jasmine Carter. Not the viral moment. Not the policy change. Not the museum exhibit. But the echo she left in every heart that heard her story. It was said that when Rosa Parks sat, she stood for a movement. When Jasmine stood in her scrubs, she carried it forward. Her daughter Maya, now older, once asked again, "Will they still remember you, Mom?" Jasmine smiled softly and replied, "They might forget my name. But they won't forget the truth I stood for." And as long as someone wore scrubs, as long as a single mother stood tall in the face of judgment, as long as one tired soul dared to speak truth in the place where silence was expected, Jasmine's echo would live on. A true echo. We tell the stories that remind us the human spirit still matters. That dignity, compassion, and truth always find a way to be heard, even when the world tries to silence them. If Jasmine's story moved you, please share it. Leave a comment below about a time you stood up when it mattered, or a time someone stood for you. And don't forget to subscribe, because here, we echo the truth.